All right, well, good morning, everybody. As Wes said, my name is Laurel. For those who don't know, I'm the kids pastor here, and I'm just excited to have this opportunity to share with you this morning. And I'm also just so glad that you guys are here, and we could have such a wonderful time to worship God and just grow together. So, we live in the age of platforms and trying to be seen, in the age of viral TikTok videos, likes, comments, and subscribers. Sometimes it seems like our lives just don't measure up to everyone else's social media, and we really can't tell the difference between what's a highlight and what's reality and what's just the day-to-day, and that can make us just feel like we're maybe not seen the way that we want to be seen, or that we're just not understood or cared for, how maybe it looks like everyone else is, whether it's entirely true or not. For the vast majority of us, most of our lives are pretty much unseen, just things like doing the dishes, coordinating kids' activities, vacuuming, mowing the lawn, whatever it might be. A lot of stuff that we do, not everyone notices. You're probably not posting all that on your social media. And if you are, maybe think again about that. But we just want to think about the way that we act doesn't always need to be in front of everybody. So today I'm speaking about Mordecai. Mordecai is probably someone you've also not had a lot of publicity on. You probably don't even all necessarily know exactly what he's done in his life. Who is Mordecai? Where has he been? What has he done? Why have we not heard anyone talk about him very much? Who knows? So today we're going to be talking about Mordecai. And so maybe all you know about him is just hearing Veggie Tales when you were a kid, the story of Esther, and he was kind of in there. Maybe you've actually read the book of Esther recently and just have seen his story played out. Maybe you've actually never heard of him. That's okay. Wherever you're at this morning, we're going to jump in together and just see what Mordecai's story can show us. And so I picked Mordecai for one reason. I just thought it was cool to do something that we maybe don't always think about. And number two, I just really connect with him. He is just more of a behind the scenes person. Obviously right now I might not be behind the scenes, but normally in what I do with kids ministry, downstairs a little more behind the scenes, and just personally, my personality prefers to just be more in the background. And so Mordecai, he is that behind-the-scenes person in the story of Esther. Esther is the queen. Who's Mordecai, right? Exactly. And so we're going to learn a little bit about him and just the way that he is faithful to all that God has called him to do in his life, whether it was for fame or not. So let's turn in our Bibles to Esther 2, 5 to 11, where we're going to jump into the first portion of the story and then track with me as we move through a few chapters of the book of Esther. So, Esther 2, 5 to 11. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiachin, king of Judah. Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. So we kind of pop into the middle of the story there, so I'll just summarize what happens firstly in chapter 1 for you guys. So chapter 1 opens, first of all, we are in Persia, and so this is not Israel's homeland. We are somewhere else because Israel, once again, fell away from God. And so at this point, there's a massive party being held by King Xerxes, who's the ruler of this area in Susa. And so he is celebrating, and as any great old king, he's probably had a little bit too much to drink. And so at this point, he asks his wife, Vashti, to come out and to impress the guests. And if you read the book further, you'll know that she said no. And you might find out that she probably was okay to say no. So she doesn't want to do that. And so, of course, the king, he is embarrassed. Who says no to the king, especially his wife? That looks really bad. And so the king, he's furious. He kicks her out of being the wife, of being the queen. She's over in the story. But the king can't be the king without a queen. someone to look pretty to be for him whenever he wants. And so he has all these women from across the land just brought in, and so then he can pick from all of these people who he wants to be his queen. And so this takes place over the course of about an entire year. And so that's where it picked up in chapter 5, 5 to 11, where Mordecai and Esther enter the scene. And so Esther, as you may already know, she is one of these women that is chosen to go with the king and stay in his palace and have all of these beauty treatments done. And so that is where we pick up. Before we go further, I just have a couple more introductory comments that we want to help us understand a broader picture of the story so far. So first, as we read already, so Mordecai and his relatives, the Jews, are in exile in Persia, coming from Jerusalem. So this means that he and his fellow Jews are feeling distant from God, both geographically and spiritually. And so they're living in a pagan culture while trying to be faithful. Second, you may or may not know this, but the book of Esther actually doesn't mention God's name a single time in the entire book, which is the only book of the Bible that is like that. Nothing is mentioned about God's name, his actions, about people even doing things that we normally would do, like pray to God or those kinds of things. And so here's a quote that just really stood out to me to help us understand this. Wallace P. Benz says, "The writer of the book of Esther is telling us, by not leaving in God's name, in a very clever way, that when it isn't obvious that God is there, he is. God is ruling and overruling in the circumstances of life. God is never mentioned anywhere in the book of Esther, but in a very real sense, he is at work throughout it." So we'll see woven throughout the book of Esther and the story of Mordecai that even when God seems distant, he is at work providing and caring for his people. Even though the Jews, Israel, fell away from God, God is not falling away from them. He is faithful to his covenant no matter what. And so a quote here as well from Billy Graham says this: "Can you see God? You haven't seen him. I've never seen the wind. I see the effects of the wind, but I've never seen the wind." There's a mystery to it. So this morning, I just encourage you guys to think about God and the way that maybe we don't notice him in everyday life. His fingerprints are in pretty much everything you might think of, but how often do we just miss the fact that he's there, active and moving in our lives? So just lock that away. Think about that as we continue on. So, Mordecai, you still don't really know who he is yet. So who is he? How does he interact with the pagan world around him while trying to remain faithful and without a position of great power such as what Esther has? So as we read in chapter 2, 5 to 11, Mordecai took over responsibility for his cousin Esther. He decides to raise her when her parents pass away. And so we don't know what age she was or what happened to her parents, but we do just see Mordecai as he steps into this role, and he decides to take care of this person who without him had most likely nothing. And so this leads us to see what it can look like to serve as a Christian in a more behind-the-scenes manner, which is the trait of compassion. So Mordecai's caring nature for Esther shows deep compassion. You might be skeptical, because I'm sure some of us in this room are skeptical about things sometimes. You might ask, did Mordecai actually care about Esther, or was it just like he kind of was forced to do this? And so it might have been culturally appropriate for him to take on this role as caretaker for his younger cousin, but at the end of the day, he wasn't forced into it. It was actually up to him to decide if he wanted to do this or not. And of course, as anyone here with kids knows, raising kids is a lot of work. I don't have experience there yet, but I know that based on my experience from my poor dear parents, they had to raise me, and it's a lot of work. And so he gives up this opportunity to raise someone that's not even his own kid. And so he raises her and cares for her, and as we'll see throughout the story, they just have a lot of trust built. And so he gives up a lot to care for her in this way. That's not just out of obligation. And I would like to pause and consider for a moment. Do you think that the book of Esther and the story we have of her would even exist at all if it wasn't for the sake of Mordecai? She wouldn't have been raised by him. Would she have even survived to this age? We don't actually know. I just think it's interesting to ponder the question of, did Mordecai really make such an impact behind the scenes that this book is even written and that we even have the story of Esther? So, we also might wonder, who's a Mordecai in my life? Many of you might be able to think of somebody who is like that, someone who sacrificed you to help you grow and survive. It could be a parent, a teacher, or a mentor. But the reality is, a lot of us still feel alone and like maybe we don't have somebody there like Esther did. We might wonder, where is Mordecai? Is he still on his lunch break? How long was that lunch break? Is there anyone around here who truly cares for me in the way that Mordecai cares for Esther? So, in the passage we read already, we get another glimpse of further on how much Mordecai continues to care for Esther. So the end of chapter 2 here, 10 to 11, we read this. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. So Esther now, as we read, she is in the palace. She's kind of stuck there, and this might be the first time that she and Mordecai have actually been split up for a long period of time, and so they're suddenly apart, and now she has really nobody that she knows to turn to and depend on with her. But we see here two things. First, Mordecai is giving advice to not share her nationality and family background. As I said before, they're in a pagan nation. People don't really like them very much there, so he's trying to see how he can protect her and help her. And this will change as the story goes on, what she does with her identity. But he's trying to help her, and we see that she really trusts him based out of the relationship that they already have. The next thing we see about Mordecai is that he doesn't just drop her off at the palace and go on vacation. In fact, he checks in on her every single day, it says, walking back and forth. So he wants to make sure that she is safe, that she is cared for every single day. And I'm sure some people, you might have somebody that every day can be that encouraging person who's checking in on you and seeing how you're doing. But some of us, maybe we don't have that. And so this is just such a powerful picture of what it can be to have that. Or maybe some of you are that person to someone. First of all, if that is you, thank you for doing that. Those people are so, so important. But maybe more of us can be that person to someone as well. So Mordecai here, he has such great compassion, such concern, and such care for this person that he was able to raise and build a relationship with. And here he probably also has concern. The wording isn't 100% clear in the original languages, but it alludes to apprehension. He knows that Esther has no control over what happens to her in this place, and so he wants to make sure that he knows what's going on and can do whatever he can to help. Would he have had a lot of power to step in? Not necessarily. But we see that he really, really does care, and he's there every single day. For me, I was in post-secondary at Columbia Bible College, not too far from here. And in my second year, I became a resident leader. So that means you're taking care of some other young women that are in your dorm unit. And so I was just there to help encourage them and walk with them and just be a friend and help them walk through what it looked like to be there in their first year, which I had been the year before. But in order for me to be able to really care for these wonderful people and pour into them the way I wanted to, I needed someone else who was there to pour into me. And so at the school, they have a system where they also have a residence director. And so this woman, she was there for me every single day that I needed. She answered my questions, she encouraged me, she helped me through tears and frustrations and confusion, and she constantly pointed me to Christ above everything else. And so the story here of Mordecai reminds us that we each need someone to be like that for us, and this is what we can be like for others and what the church ought to look like. That continual support that just keeps going and going and going, like a waterfall effect. So, in chapter 2, 19 to 23, Esther at this point has become queen, continues to live away from Mordecai permanently. But Mordecai, we see, has a little bit of action while sitting outside of the king's gate. So here we get to see a little bit more about his character apart from Esther. So in chapter 2, starting in verse 19. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do, for she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions, as she has done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot, told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So, that might not be the most cheerful story. You might not hear all those verses. You might not post them on your Instagram bios. But there's a few really key things that we can understand about this section. So first, we see that Esther is continuing to trust Mordecai. She's continuing to kind of keep her identity to herself for the time being because she knows it's for her safety, and she knows that Mordecai wants just what is best for her. Their relationship is still strong, which likely stems of the years of growth together. Second, we see Mordecai in the right place at the right time, overhearing an assassination attempt on the king. And so this is a good example of God using human agents on earth to work out his plans for good. Mordecai was able to relay this really important information to Esther, who had been put into this position of queen, and she was able to tell the king, which inevitably saved his life. And so Esther and Mordecai, the king probably wasn't their favorite person. He's not from Israel, but yet they knew that what they should do is save him from this bad thing that was going to happen. And we also see here that Mordecai himself gets absolutely no honor or credit at this point in time. It was customary in the books of the Bible here, when there's Persian kings, they would give massive rewards and appreciation to people who did good things, especially like saving the king's life. I think that's a pretty big deal. But he is still overlooked here, and although his name is written down, at this point, nothing happens, even though probably it actually should have. So there are very few things that hurt our egos like being overlooked. When you feel like you deserve a reward, but yet absolutely nothing happens. This is where we often find bitterness. And so think of work. You've got a coworker that maybe you think is a little lazy, is just hanging out on their phone all the time, and yet they get promoted and you don't, even though you work hard every single day. Or think of being at home. You're the one cleaning up, working really hard, trying to do everything you can, and someone in your family comes home and they see one little thing on the floor and are frustrated about it. How do we react when we try our best but don't get the recognition that we think that we maybe deserve? And maybe we do deserve it in a sense, but yet how do we react to that? Here we see Mordecai's response shows humility in his character, not seeking reward. And as we see in the New Testament, humility is a virtue that we want in our lives. So 1 Peter 5:6 and James 4:10 both say in very similar phrasing, "Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will be the one to lift you up." And so we're not the ones trying to seek all this attention and glory, even though it might feel really, really good. But we see that Mordecai here, he understands what to do, and he does it, and he doesn't complain. He just moves on no matter what. So two people that this kind of reminds me of is my mom and my dad. So my dad, he's a camp director, and he does a lot of awesome things at the camp, more behind the scenes, but also leading and just making sure things happen. And yet at times, he'll be the one to just jump up and do stuff that nobody else probably wants to do. He's often up greeting people, whether it's hot and humid or just pouring rain and cold. He'll be the one out there for hours and hours, making sure people feel welcome. Or other times, I've seen him just jump in behind the scenes in the kitchen. If they're down a couple people and just need the dishes to be done for that day, he'll just jump in there and do that. That's definitely not on his job description, at least I'm pretty sure, but he just jumps in there and tries to do what he can. Not trying to get attention or reward, but just faithfully serving in the way that he sees needs to be done. And then my mom, another example, not in a position of leadership like a camp director, but the way that she serves, she stayed at home with me and my brother for years and years, homeschooled us even though we were super difficult, especially when we were younger. And then forever and ever when we've been at the camp, she serves as an amazing volunteer behind the scenes, just working faithfully, spending hours and hours and hours just trying to serve and help things run better and support people. And so she's not seeking recognition, but serving diligently and going above and beyond. So obviously both of these people, they're not perfect, neither is Mordecai, but we just see that when something comes up in front of them, they want to serve with humility and just do what they see God calling them to do in the moment. So we see so far that Mordecai has a lot of compassion, a lot of humility, and now we'll see a little bit about his faith as well. So in chapter 3, a new character enters the scene. We get a glimpse into part of Mordecai's faith that makes him stand out. And in chapter 4, that we'll get to in a minute, there's even more evidence of his faith in God, despite circumstances that are not ideal and maybe even are tragic. So we pick up right after Mordecai was supposedly, he saved the king's life, but then he didn't get honored. And so we read here in chapter 3, verse 1. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, not Mordecai, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. So if you keep reading that chapter, you see that people are asking him, like, why are you not doing this? And then, Mordecai just continues to not want to bow down. And so Haman finds out who Mordecai is, that he is Jewish. And so Haman gets very angry because he's the kind of guy that wants all of the attention, all of the honor, all of the respect, and he's not getting it from Mordecai. So he finds out that Mordecai is Jewish and decides that not only Mordecai, but he wants all of Israel, all of the Jewish people there to be killed because of Mordecai's actions. But these are actions that we can see as one that glorify God, not giving worship to man. So from this part of the story, now we're suddenly seeing the hatred against the Jewish people. This is an example of why Mordecai was concerned for Esther's safety in the first 2 chapters of this book. Because who knows what would have happened to her, even though she had been crowned queen, that doesn't make anyone like you anymore necessarily. And so here we see that Mordecai acts against what he was commanded to by man, which seems to parallel the faithfulness of people like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that we heard Lyndon preach on a few weeks ago. So in the book of Esther, as we've said, God is not mentioned, so this act isn't explicitly tied to his faith in God. But we see that it is still him trying to honor God and be faithful, even though it's just a different situation. So he is trying to be faithful, even though he knew that the punishment could be great, and now he and all of his people are to be slaughtered. So here we see Mordecai's obedience and trust in God show faith instead of fear. Mordecai continues to have great faith in chapter 4, where he comes up with a plan to redeem the whole situation through his position and Esther's position as the queen. So, pick up with me again, if you have your Bibles with you, in chapter 4, verse 12. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for all the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Now that last phrase there, you've probably heard if you've heard anything about the book of Esther, the very famous "for such a time as this" part of the passage. But since we're focusing more on Mordecai this morning, I want to point you to the verse, just 1 or 2 verses before that. So Mordecai is talking to Esther, and he says this to her: "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for all the Jews will arise from another place." And so this is suggesting that he actually has such faith in God that he wants to encourage Esther, yes, to do her job, to step up, to talk to the king, which is terrifying and putting her life on the line. But he also knows that even if she doesn't do that, it doesn't rely all on her, but God will have another plan because something from another place will arise. Because he knows that, yes, they have fallen short as the Jewish people, but that God is keeping faithful to his side of the covenant and will not let all of his people die just for this. So the Jews had fallen away from God, which is why we're now in this exiled land away from him. But God is remaining faithful to his covenants, to these people and to us, even though we still fall short as well. And so Mordecai grasps this and knows that God will still deliver his people in one way or another. Now, we're only 4 to 10 chapters through the book of Esther. We don't have time, unfortunately, to go through all 10, so read it later if you are interested. But we've already seen a great amount of Mordecai's character. So we've seen Mordecai in these 3 key ways live out his faith so boldly. Mordecai's caring nature for Esther shows humility. Mordecai's responses show humility in his character, not seeking reward, and Mordecai's obedience and trust in God show faith instead of fear. Compassion, humility, and faith. You might be wondering, well, what happens next? What happens to Esther and all the Jewish people? At this point, nothing has been done to save them, but we know that God has been working behind the scenes from start to finish of this entire story. As we talked about, you probably remember that Mordecai saved the king's life from assassination earlier. He never got honored, but instead Haman, the enemy of Israel and his people, was raised and glorified and given a position of leadership. Mordecai likely at this moment had some questions like the prophet Jeremiah in Jeremiah 12:1. "You are always righteous, Lord, when I bring a case before you. Yet I would speak with you about your justice. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all the faithless live at ease?" So Mordecai, he has been through a lot. He's trying to do what he can, trying to raise Esther, trying to save the king, trying to honor God, and yet he sees evil seemingly to triumph at this time. But if you keep going through the book of Esther, you see that the king one night, he can't sleep, which, coincidence? Probably not. Right around when the Jews were about to die, he had his records read to him. And as we remember, he had written down before about Mordecai's great act that saved his life in this book. And in this moment, the king recalls that nothing has been done to honor Mordecai. So through a great turn of events, Haman, the man who put the evil plan into effect, ended up suffering for his actions. Meanwhile, Mordecai was honored. God reversed the roles so that even though evil seemed to triumph for a while, Good would win in the end. So Mordecai, later on, he's moved to a position of leadership. He's able to try and save his people through Esther. And so this echoes a verse from Genesis 50 about Joseph when he was sold into slavery. Joseph is saying this to his brothers later on. You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So God didn't leave them on their own, and he had plans from the start to care for Israel even when they were in exile. As we read in Romans 8:28, it says, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Now, life might not always turn out the way it does here. Things do work out. The people of Israel are saved. Mordecai and Esther are honored. We might not always get that. Sometimes we do all these things, we try our best, and evil still seems to triumph, or we go unnoticed. And yet there are so many people throughout Scripture and history who also have been faithful to God in all these areas of their life, but never get to see the fruits of it for themselves. But God honors us, and he knows and he sees when we are faithful behind the scenes or in front of everyone, and he knows what we do and where our hearts are at. Listen to these words that capture the essence of this so well. The message comes through clearly. God's methods may vary, but his purposes do not. His workings may be obscured to skeptics by the disguise of a coincidence, but the people of God recognize his sovereign hand in the ebb and flow of history. His name is not mentioned, at least in the book of Esther, but his influence is unmistakable. I also see here a connection to the story of Jesus. As we see there in Esther, there was this reversal of evil was triumphing and good was suffering, and it was switched around. And we see that also with the life of Jesus. Jesus was able to suffer and die, which is such a horrible thing, and he didn't even do a single thing that was wrong. And yet he came back from death to life in order that we may also be raised to new life in Christ, should we put our faith in him, which is the biggest reversal of all time. As Karen H. Jobes puts it, Christ's resurrection from the grave is the ultimate reversal of expected outcomes. Even the disciples were confused. They had been with Jesus for so long, and yet they had no idea what to do when Jesus died. But God was still working, and 3 days later, Jesus was raised from the dead. So as we wrap up our time together, there's just a few things I would love us to think about as we go from here. So first, as you've probably picked up on by now, God is always at work, even when we don't see or understand. His name isn't mentioned in the book of Esther, but his actions and care are so evident constantly. We need to always look for God where he's acting, whether it's in a big miracle or just behind the scenes, and remind others of this amazing truth, both in the good and the bad times. Second, through Mordecai, we see the power of just individual faithful action, even from a place not of leadership, not of authority, that's not very popular or well known. We can see that he wants to be compassionate and humble with faith, and that can resonate with us whether we are up on stage, whether you're teaching people, or where you're just diligently serving at work or at home. Was Mordecai perfect? Not necessarily, but he tried to do what he could. And third, like Esther and Mordecai, we live in a pagan world where we don't always see all these miracles happening all the time, but just the subtlety of God in daily life. So we want to be like Mordecai, to be faithful just in our day-to-day lives in whatever God is doing. And so with Mordecai, we see that Mordecai was someone whose fruit grew on someone else's tree. He raised Esther and cared for her. He saved the king's life, and he eventually was able to save his own people. Not much is ever really said about what he liked to do, how he spent his weekends, or anything really about him. We just see the ways that he is putting others first and doing what he can to be faithful where he is at. And so right in this room, there's probably many people acting as Mordecais, even that I'm not thinking of. Some people I think of are back here in the tech booth. If it weren't for them, you wouldn't see me. The lights would be off. You wouldn't hear me because I can't project quite that loudly. And you wouldn't have these slides behind me either. So we need people like them, people like so many of you who serve behind the scenes, not trying to get recognition or reward, but just trying to be there to do something that they can do for others and serve so well. And so a lot of us, we maybe have been Mordecais, or maybe you can think of a Mordecai in your life. They might not even come to mind right away. That's probably because they've been behind the scenes and you don't think of them all of the time. So for those of us who call ourselves Christians, there are so many ways that we can be Mordecais to others. So up on the screen, I'm going to have a list of a bunch of ways that you can be a Mordecai. But there's many, many more that you can brainstorm later. So within Central Heights, people serve in so many areas, which is so amazing. We don't always see it. Some of them, maybe like the worship team, we see more than others, but they are still putting in practice and time behind the scenes being Mordecais. But there's just so many ways that we can serve others just at church. Beyond Central Heights, I could list hundreds of ways if I took the time, but a few ideas just include visiting a retirement home to play games with seniors, serving in a soup kitchen or food bank, or just buying food and clothes for someone you might bump into on the street who's in need. And so there's just so many ways that we can care for others and serve others. It doesn't have to be a scheduled thing like maybe I would like to do. It can more just be a spur of the moment, sporadic, see a need, fill the need. Another idea, this one is not possible for all of us, but maybe you have a business that you run, and maybe you see someone in need who doesn't have a job and likely can't get a job on their own. You could see if there's a way to hire them, to just clothe them and give them a clean shower and help them to rebuild their life. There's so many ways that we can try to adopt an Esther or something like that and make just a lifelong impact. Again, I'm not just trying to get volunteers, as much as we always need volunteers, but I just want to remind us that there's so many ways that we can serve people and love people and care for people, whether it's at our church, outside of our church, just in the relationships with those around us. And I really just want you guys all to hear this. No matter how old you are, there's some kids in the room here. Just know that you're never too young to be a Mordecai either. Mordecai in the story here, he's a little bit older, but you're never too young to serve people, to be a friend to someone with no friends, to write a card, to do any little act of kindness that can really just impact somebody. And you're also never too old to be a Mordecai. Mordecai probably was on the older end of people, and yet he gave of his life time and time again to serve and care. So I just encourage you, no matter where you're at in life, young or old or anywhere in between, there is a way that you can serve and care for others. And so also, if there's anyone here, maybe you're still discovering Jesus, and you're like, this is a lot to ask of me right now. I don't even know what this looks like. There are people in this room who are Mordecais, and so we want to connect you with somebody who has lived this life for Jesus for a long time and just can be that Mordecai to pour into you. So if you're here and you want that, come talk to me or one of the pastors or the prayer teams that'll be up in a minute, and we just want to connect you with somebody that can pour into your life. So as we go this week, I encourage you all to just think about a tangible way that you can serve somebody else. You can be a Mordecai or how you can find a Mordecai, whether here or anywhere else. You could even just invite somebody to lunch after this. So as we go, I just want to remind you to be full of compassion, humility, and faith. Step out of your comfort zone and take a risk. Give of yourself without expecting a reward in this lifetime. Serve Jesus with all he's given you and find or be a Mordecai today. So let's bow our heads and pray. Lord, thank you for people like Mordecai in Scripture that we often forget about but can learn so much from. Thank you for being at work, whether we always notice or not. I pray that you would help us to see what we can do to be behind the scenes in other people's lives and serve them, and help us to remember that you're always working too. Give us courage and wisdom and boldness to trust you and give up ourselves for your glory and honor. In Jesus' name, amen.